What charge did Tertullus make against Paul before Felix in Acts 24? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 24, verses 1 to 9, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 24, verse 1, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 24, beginning at verse 1. Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, "Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity as being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him." And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. Paul had been held as a prisoner in Jerusalem by the Roman commander Claudius Lysias. The reason why Paul was being held was because a Jewish mob had formed trying to kill Paul for supposedly bringing in a Gentile into the temple, something Paul had not done. Knowing that he could not hold Paul without charges, yet at the same time not release Paul for fear of a riot, Lysias sent Paul by night to Felix so that Felix could judge the matter. Lysias told Paul's accusers to take Paul's case before Felix if they wanted to see him put to death. And because Paul was a Roman citizen, a trial before his accusers by a judge was Paul's right. And so 5 days after Paul arrived in Caesarea, Ananias the high priest, the elders, and an orator named Tertullus came to Felix to make their case. Now, why would the Jews bring Tertullus with them? Why wouldn't Ananias simply have made the case? Well, there are a couple things to consider. First, Tertullus was an orator, while the high priest likely was not. As an orator and lawyer, perhaps the Jews thought that Felix could be sweet-talked into handing Paul over to them to be executed, as they appear to try to do during Tertullus's speech, which we will look at in a few moments. The second thing to consider is that Tertullus is a Roman name, meaning that this man was likely a Roman. And as a Roman, Tertullus would also be better versed in Roman law, and most likely would be able to be better regarded by Felix than a Jew would be. And third, Luke leaves us a little ignorant of the political climate in Judea at this time. When it comes to the position of high priest, how one was selected was no longer from father to son through the house of Aaron. It was the one who curried favor with those in power by Rome. During the likely year that this trial took place before Felix, there were about 3 high priests that year. Ananias would soon be deposed. His successor Jonathan would shortly be killed by Felix, resulting in a 3rd high priest, Ishmael ben Fabus, being appointed by Herod Agrippa, a man we'll meet in the next chapter. So perhaps the political climate was such that Ananias didn't have the confidence to stand before Felix himself and make these charges directly. Whatever the case, Tertullus is the one who speaks. And just like Lysias did in the last chapter, he begins his speech by flattering Felix. Remember, from the last lesson, we said Felix is a man prone to taking bribes, so flattery is a tactic that could very well work if employed properly. His flattery involved telling Felix how peaceful and prosperous it was during his governance, conditions that the Jews accepted with all thankfulness. In truth, the Jews hated the Romans and would rebel against them not a decade from the date of this speech. But Tertullus didn't want to lay it on so thick that Felix might not hear the underlying charge. So Tertullus continues by saying that Paul was a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout all the world, and he was a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes, a name of contempt given by Jews to Christians based on the fact that Jesus was from Nazareth. Recall from the Gospels that Nazareth was a small town and often looked down upon. Even Nathanael, one of Jesus' disciples, asked before he became a disciple in John 1:46, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Tertullus concludes by saying that Paul even tried to profane the temple when he was seized by the Jews, who simply desired to try him according to their law. However, Lysias violently took him from them and sent him to Felix, forcing the Jews to have to accuse Paul before Felix. Let's dissect Tertullus' speech now. First, whether or not Paul caused dissension among the Jews worldwide was not a concern of Felix, because Felix didn't have worldwide jurisdiction. The only thing that would matter to Felix was Paul's actions in Judea. If other people in other places wanted to try Paul, they would have to come and get him. Second, that Paul was a ringleader of any sect of the Jews, Nazarene or not, would be of no consequence to Felix, because that wasn't against Roman law. Third, Felix really wouldn't be concerned with the defiling of the Jerusalem temple, for yet again it had nothing to do with Roman law. If Paul's actions at the temple resulted in a mob, that is something that might be of interest to Felix. But in testifying here, Tertullus lied to Felix. How? Recall back to chapter 21. What did the Jews do when Paul was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple? Did they have him arrested and brought before the council? No, they formed a mob and were in the process of killing Paul, and would have done so if it was not for the intervention of Lysias. The only violence done in this case was by the Jews towards Paul. They had no interest in justice. They wanted revenge against Paul for what he taught about Jesus. Now, I don't believe Felix, even though he was an evil man, was a stupid man. He had the letter of Lysias, his Roman commander, already, and Lysias' letter contradicted Tertullus' speech. What was Felix to do? Well, first he would have to hear from the defendant, Paul, a defense that we will cover, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 24, verses 10 to 21, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.